Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm here today with one of the co-authors of this paper, Graham, who's going to come up here later on during this talk, so we can have sort of a discussion with the audience as well, because this model is very much a work in progress that we're sort of just presenting sort of the initial rough ideas with you guys today, and then we basically want your feedback in terms of how we can improve upon it. So just to give a quick overview of the talk, first I'm going to talk a bit about the definitions of cyberspace and sort of why it's difficult to talk about to begin with, and sort of going towards the cyber attacks and defenses aspect of that, and why it's difficult to fully understand the impacts of cyber attacks, but how to deal with them in more general terms as well. Essentially, the model is a way to express aspects of attacks and cyber defenses in such a way that you can better understand how to make decisions. And I talk about this certainly from the decision maker's perspective. So if you are a policy person, you need to understand other aspects. If you're a techie person, you need to understand the business operation aspects. There's lots of different things, and I'll cover them all in this talk. The purpose of the model is to be agnostic to who the decision maker is, and sort of attempt to facilitate better discussion about cyber attacks and defenses more generally. And towards the end, like I said, start a discussion about the model. Is it complete? What's missing? We don't think it's complete. We think a lot of stuff is missing, and that's sort of why I'm here today. Cyberspace. We kind of treat it as like the conceptual landscape where people and machines interact. It's very ill-defined, I think, which causes lots of miscommunication, misunderstanding, unnecessary struggle between people who are on the same side, right? We're trying to convey the same things, but the same words mean subtly different things to different people. Lots of disagreements to what it is. Some people say that the concept of cyberspace doesn't even exist. Others have a very opposite opinion of that. But one thing we can say about this concept, if you will, is that it's ever-changing, right? The web and the internet is not what it was 10 years ago, and we have to adapt to it. That includes the terminology, how we deal with it at a policy level, how we deal with it in terms of responses. Who talks about cyberspace? Well, lots of people. I mean, computer scientists, security analysts, ethicists, lawyers, military people, policymakers, politicians, media, the list just goes on, right? And we need to make sure that everyone speaks the same language, because this is really, really tricky. Everyone has to have the same understanding of as many aspects as possible. And we have to have experts of the various disciplines be able to to communicate their views and expertise and their concerns adequately in such a way that other people are able to fully understand what they mean, right? And this is especially the case for decision makers. In terms of cyber attacks, I'm giving cyber attacks as an example today, whereas we imagine the model could be extended to talk about observables in cyberspace more generally, but for the purpose of this talk, we're focusing on cyber attack models. A lot of cyber attack models today fall into one of two categories. It's either process-driven or sort of a hierarchical classification or taxonomy approach. What I mean by process-driven is that you can describe an attack in terms of multiple steps. You do step one, then you move on to step two, then you move on to step three, and then eventually you'll have done your attack. There's also the hierarchical approach, which basically tries to break down the different components of an attack, and then from that you can sort of build what makes up the attack, but you don't necessarily describe it in terms of steps, if you will. So there are many, many different models. I'm not going to go into too much detail on them, but a couple models are the Bishop and Cohen model, which sort of attempt to describe attacks in terms of the properties of those attacks, if you will. So Bishop expresses it in terms of a six-axis, six-dimension way, if you will. Cohen describes it in terms of properties, things like, for instance, talking about the effectiveness relationship between attacks. So for instance, if you have one attack plus another attack combined together, what does that mean? Does that mean that both of them are going to be more effective? not necessarily the case, right? So you can have one attack sort of making another attack redundant. So, and he's sort of describing all these different aspects of attack. That's just being one example, really. And those are sort of more classification, taxonomy-based approaches. Then you have Howard, which is more of a process-based. It's describing the several steps to do to achieve an attack. And then you have the verdict approach, which is also another taxonomy-based approach, which looks at again the characteristics of the network attacks, if you will. Avoid it is another taxonomy-based approach where you have an attack and its components, if you will, and then they try to break down every single thing. The cyber kill chain is another one, which is process-based, where you have different steps happening from you start off with reconnaissance activity, then you look at weaponizing your exploit, if you will, from the data that you have collected from the reconnaissance. Then you look at the delivery mechanism of your weapon. Then you actually do the exploitation. Then you install your.
Sorry, there was.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. Okay, it was here.
Okay, don't worry. Then there is the.
Yes.
Thank you. Is it the middle one? Yeah, but as in where do I?
Just the point.
Oh, I see, okay. Oh, the little star. Ah, brilliant, okay. So installation is where you actually do, well, the installation of the piece of malware that you're interested in doing, or you actually deploy the attack, if you will. And then towards the end, there's the actual, once you're in, how do you maintain presence and that sort of thing. Then there's the efforts of MITRE. They describe something called CAPEC, which is classification of attack patterns, if you will. Also another sort of hierarchical approach. Then you have other models that sort of look at the social and people centric aspects of attack. So there's lots of different works on this sort of subject, looking at predictive modeling, metrics for evaluating, but also like just pure guidelines, if you will. Like here's a manual that looks at different guidelines. Some of the work we've been doing at Oxford also looks at the insider threat problem by combining machine learning and visual analytics. There's also the cyber situational awareness and the more cyber understanding model, where you have many different parties looking at different things, trying to understand what is cyber and how do you obtain a better situational awareness and understanding of cyber more generally as well, including taking aspects from other disciplines like sense making, which I will describe shortly in a bit. So the problems that we're finding with all of these models is that there's many different models, and they're probably very good for what the authors are intending them to do, but they are different solutions to the same problem. They're very difficult to formalize and generalize. They tend to follow the trends of the time, so they tend to be they may not be future-proof in the same sense that some of the stuff that came out in the early 90s may not be as valid anymore because we've seen many new types of attack, if you will, like phishing attempts and that sort of thing didn't really exist in the mid-90s. And new concepts are always emerging, and that limits the amount of ability to understand attacks. There's the human element as well, which is often ignored in many of these models, not just in terms of humans in the attack itself, but humans who are going to understand the attack as well. And who is the model intended for, right? That's something that's not really covered in a lot of these models. And trying to identify what are the weaknesses of the human who's supposed to make the decisions by using this model, if you will. So a lot of these models need some kind of technical skill at some level in order to decide what to do with the cyber attack. And today we see more and more that that's not feasible because you need people who are experts of different areas to come up with a good decision altogether. Why should we care though about this understanding of cyber attacks? Well, if you just leave it to the cyber analysts, cybersecurity analysts, and they will probably have a very good understanding at a technical level what the attack does. But if incorrect decisions are made, well, it can affect mission operations. It can have an impact on the physical assets that you have in your mission. It can have huge financial costs. It can have legal consequences, and in some cases, it can also escalate politically. But what's important here is that each person sort of sees what attacks are with their own unique perspective. And so it's difficult to make the right decision unless all these different perspectives have been taken into account, right? And we all sort of make sense out of these attacks very differently. I mean, even the audience here today come from a variety of different backgrounds, some legal, some policy, some techies, some international relations. It can be anything, right? So, but what we all have in common though is that we have this ability to sort of form mental models of what we imagine are attacks. So, and those mental models, if you will, they are uniquely yours. And they are shaped from your past experiences, your knowledge, your intelligence, your culture. And by culture, I mean working culture and the society you live in, right? All these sort of things play into how you're forming your mental image of what a particular incident means and how I should respond to it, right? But also the standards you adhere to. So for instance, if you are interested in, if you use a particular standard, then you may tend to follow them because that's how you've been taught, as in you just follow that way of thinking because you don't really want to think outside the box. And but basically what I'm trying to say is that a common understanding between all parties is extremely difficult. So coming to what we propose today, essentially a model to better understand events in cyberspace, allowing decision makers to use the same reference point, be able to allow decision makers to have this, to identify their knowledge gaps, and from that form, basically look at updating their mental model, if you will, based on finding, after having identified their knowledge gaps, they can focus their efforts on those aspects. So it also allows, our model is also attempting to look at different aspects of cyberspace with regards to their relationship with other aspects in cyberspace. I'll show that in a second, but we also consider this, the decision-making process, a weighting problem, and I'll describe what that exactly means in a second. And we also consider this in terms of cyber attacks at the moment, but like I said, you cannot obviously expand this. Please note though, it's been mostly a theoretical exercise, not been tested, and that's sort of where we want to go next with it. So with weighting problem, what I mean is, and I kind of touched upon this earlier, is that if you are a security analyst, then you will know a lot of the technical aspects of an attack, but you may not understand some of the business side of things. If you're a business manager, you may not understand the business side. If you're into policy or you're a political person, then you may have an understanding of political ramifications of attacks, but you may not understand the technical aspects or even the business aspects. Depends on your role, right? So essentially, the decision makers should put more consideration on the topics that they are not an expert on. So the model essentially tries to break down things in terms of categories, if you will. Very broad categories. One is looking at the attributes. So what are the inputs of the attack? And then what are the outputs of the attack? What are the perceived effects of an attack? So what I mean by that is, what things are we placing in terms of values of an attack? So for instance, the fact that the Coca-Cola recipe has been stolen, what does that mean, right? As in, it may it's just a piece of information, right? But it's not. It's important for someone, and that someone, maybe for them, that piece of information is vital. But there's also looking at the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of those attacks. And so if you sort of plot this into a big mind map, you'll essentially get something like this, which basically looks at, so for instance, at the top, you see attributes of attack. Who's the owner of the attack? Who are the adversaries of the attack? What's the intention of the attack? What's the agility of the attack? The agility, I essentially mean things like what does the attack actually do and how flexible is the attack in terms of its capability. Then you have the values of the attack. What values are we placing on this as a consequence of the attack? So information, the social ramifications, the assets, the reputation, and the list goes on, right? So you can keep populating this so that you can sort of have this map essentially, which allows you to express what values are being affected by this particular attack. And then there's the actual measurable impact of the attack, right? Things like, I say visibility, but you may not actually see the attack happening at all. But in some cases, you may see it, and then But essentially, we're looking at what's the visibility of the attack, how long is the attack lasting, what's the actual measurable costs or reputation of the attack itself. Similarly, you could also mirror this to sort of look at the defense aspect, and then the last bit, which is the mitigation. So, for instance, what are the weaknesses of the attack in the sense that what sort of things can I put in place to recover quickly from the attack? What sort of things can I do to make myself more resilient to the attack as well? What risk assessment should I do? So these are sort of things that we're sort of exploring at the moment. And on the defense side, you're looking at who's the owner of the defense and who are my adversaries of that defense. So it's basically looking at it from the reverse order, if you will. So how to use this model? First, we imagine as like a thought experiment, establish the vocabulary and attempt to find your knowledge gaps, and communication is key between all parties. And I really have to emphasize that communication really is key, because you'll have people using the same words but talking about very, very different things. So where's next? Well, we imagine that we can use this to think about real case studies, talk to real decision makers, review past cases of cyber attacks, but also look at doing possible surveys to do requirements captures, what is needed for a model like this. And that's also one of the things I'm really keen to hear from you guys today. Like, how do I make sure that an approach like this, where people use the same reference point, are able to communicate everything as best possible?